Okay, I am going to need a clicker, unless I do the next slide, but don't do the next slide yet. But hi, thank you all for being here. And I know the last talk of the day, even if it's starting a little earlier than previously planned, is still a little bit hard to get through. But good news, there is no code on slides. We do have some cat pictures, but no code on slides. But I am going to talk about some kind of heavy stuff, because I think we have conversations that are maybe a little overdue, and maybe we're starting to have in tech. So the traditional second slide, who I am. I live in Minnesota. We hold, by the way, jumping ahead to DevOps Days, we hold our DevOps Days in July because it is the 1 month of the year that Minnesota has never logged snow anywhere in its borders. So I come here and people are like, oh, it's so cold. I'm like, no, it's definitely not. I do tech advocacy for Microsoft, and more on that later. And I podcast with Arrested DevOps, and I am actually the chief cook and bottle washer in charge of the DevOps Days organization. I think that we have 64 conferences on 6 continents this year. And fun fact, the DevOps Days Amsterdam is actually this week, so later this week. You can check devopsdays.org for conferences near you. Maybe start one in your city. Okay, so it's kind of weird that I was looking at some old textbooks because I got a CS degree in the 90s during the last AI hype cycle, actually. And I was looking at my Scheme textbook, and I said, why is there a wizard on the front? It's kind of ridiculous. But then it actually isn't if you think about the fact that we write code that creates reality. Like, everyone in this room is probably the closest to a practitioner of magic that actually exists, which is a little bit weird. And I don't know about you, but I grew up reading, fantasy, but also a lot of sci-fi. And I assumed I would live in the sci-fi reality. Well, I think we ended up in, the reality we ended up in is the oppressive cyberpunk dystopia. So we don't live in the Jetsons. We live in Blade Runner or something like it. And what I think that we have to worry about with that is that we've all read a lot of fiction, we've seen a lot of movies about this universe that we are finding ourselves in. I think what we need to worry about is that there's a lot of effects on the actual people. I mean, the rest of the people in this world, the ones who can't write the code to create the reality, are not NPCs, and they're not bit players. They are all the protagonists of their own narrative. And we have the weighty responsibility of making a narrative that they might want to actually live in. Maybe. That they might actually be able to survive in. No pressure, but that's your job. You get to leave here, after a couple of days, a few days of workshops and, talks about exciting tech, you get to leave and take that tech and try to make the world slightly less terrible. I'm not going to say make it good because we might be past that, but make it slightly less terrible, right? So let's talk about a few of the areas that I think we can use to do that. We can hopefully make the if we can stave off some of the dystopian present, it's not a future anymore, that we're living in. If we can think about how we're connecting to each other as people, how we're making sure that people have the ability to consent to what's happening around them, and some amount of privacy, even if just in their own minds, and actual safety, and that's not just metaphorical, unfortunately. So first of all, with consent, we all want very fine-grained control over our lives, whether it's we're extremely picky about how we configure our editors, or I don't know about you, but I still use VI for everything, and I call it VI. This newfangled Vim is what? But we all want some control over the world that we live in, and a lot of the systems that we're creating, the settings aren't necessarily intuitive. They don't necessarily default to what someone might actually want if they really understood the settings. And we're not necessarily doing that because we're bad people. Maybe it was expedient, or maybe it led to the right direction for the sales funnel. But I think we really need to think about that in terms of what kind of defaults are we giving people that are they going to be happy with that default when they understand it? Like, if you're explaining to your family members what a default actually means and you find yourself saying, I'm so sorry, like, it gets really old apologizing on behalf of your fellow technologists and the decisions that they're making. I feel like we should be prioritizing what our users would decide if they could and if they actually understood the stuff that we've made sort of hard to understand. So yeah, just the idea of like informed consent, responsible disclosure, having people explicitly agree to having their data shared, or explicitly agree to having their location shared, or explicitly agree to whatever it is that might not be great for them or might put them at risk. I think it's really important for us to be at least honest with our end users about what we're doing with their data and what toggles they actually have available to them, what decisions they can make. I think there's a lot of anti-patterns around consent in tech, and there's a lot of dark UX patterns that I think the motivations are mostly driven by ad revenue. More on that later, too. I am not entirely guilt-free in that realm. OK, but let's talk about privacy for a minute. And I think that this one is interesting because I'm standing here in Europe, and GDPR took hold. And from the vantage point of the US, the main thing that I'm noticing, well, two things. I come to Europe, and boy, every single website wants me to click a lot of things. And in the US, we got an awful lot of emails telling us about accounts that we forgot to close, that we then went and closed. I assume you probably got those emails, too. But I think that when we're thinking about how we're dealing with user data, I mean, of course, there's the general principles that are in GDPR that hopefully the US will actually start to institute things like that, too. But there's also that idea of, OK, even if you're going to like deactivate someone's account or remove it, like, how do you go remove them from all the individual roll-ups? And how do you go remove them from all the reporting? And what about things that are archived? And what about your wide column data store with a whole bunch of versions in there? I mean, it starts getting kind of complex really fast. And I think a good way for us to think about it is maybe we should just limit the amount of individually identifiable information we're storing in the first place. Like, how much of that do we really need? How much of it do we actually act on? And how much of it have we created a huge hassle for ourselves in terms of having to clean it up? So I would say, like, if we collect less of it in the first place, let alone retain it for analysis, we have a lot less to worry about in terms of our culpability. And this is where I admit to you that when the Cambridge Analytica Facebook data stuff came out, I was not even remotely surprised, because I worked at an ad tech firm from 2012 to 2014. And if you're familiar with Facebook stuff at all, you're aware that, oh yeah, that was before they changed the terms of service in 2014 and expired everybody's tokens in 2015, well, almost everyone's, so that you couldn't get friends likes anymore. So what we had was people installing our app, and when they authorized our app on Facebook in order to tell their friends about the things they bought at the baby store or whatever, we would harvest all their friends' likes. Their friends didn't opt into this. Their friends didn't even know our app existed. And we would use this in order to build profiles, work with retailers. Like, there was all sorts of stuff, hopefully not terribly evil. But on the other hand, there's a great deal of not opting in. And these people had no idea that their information was being used like this. And if you're thinking like, oh, but Facebook doesn't do that exact thing anymore. Well, sort of. And today, it's very easy to collect a lot of data with very little accountability. So again, like, as technologists, we need to think, how are we participating in that? Because there are people who, it's not just which baby products they bought, it's maybe the fact that they're buying them or not buying them at all. There's a lot of things around people's personal lives that all of their online history shows. So I think that whether it's overly broad app permissions or like completely intrusive on-site tracking, there's a lot of stuff in there that we need to consider what we're doing. And this, I think it's important for us to focus on principle of least privilege. Like, how much of this data do we actually need in the first place? And also, I don't know if you've seen some of that stuff that's come out about like when you put in the wrong email address to auth on a website and it says like, that's not your password, and then it says like your name or whatever, and you're like, that's not my name, it just revealed something to me. I think it's really important for us to think about exactly how we're storing things and how we're showing them in terms of, again, protecting our end users or people who encounter them, people who know them. And the third thing that I want to talk about, and these are all interconnected, these are all related, is security. And that's a very easy word to be like, woo, security. Security in the abstract, like we can just say, we care. It becomes a lot more concrete when, say, people are being targeted by a government. When you're starting to have those discussions, like in terms of which organizations is your employer working with, it becomes very like hella relevant immediately. And whether people are being targeted like metaphorically via profiling or like literally via drones or imprisonment, there's human effects to everything that we're working on. And I think it's really important and grounding for us to think about that. Like whatever we're working on could have super critical implications to how someone's life goes, which is kind of sobering to think about, but we have to think about it. Whether it's the US immigration news from last week or anything else, there's been a lot of this kind of news lately. So I think it's important that usually if someone comes to you and says like, create a system for data mining and surveillance, and you can be like, no, but maybe they come to you and say, let's just make everything more effective and more efficient. And you're like, efficiency is great. And later you're like, I made evil more efficient. That wasn't really what I wanted. And I think, again, as technologists, these are questions that we have to ask. You can start by asking them inside your organization. There's also a plethora of hashtags and community out there on Twitter of people having these conversations across organizations. Because we need to be having safeguards to prevent individual people or population groups from being targeted systematically and negatively because of our work. Like, presumably, and again, like I mentioned AI, and like you can just kind of, like paste some AI on anything, but really this is the problem, right? It would be very simple for us to say, well, I'm not going to make a decision to do a terrible thing. Yeah, but probably no human is making the individual decision to do a lot of terrible things. Instead, we're building systems and setting them loose and being like, good luck, have fun, hope you don't turn into the Cylons. Like, that's actually, we have to think about that, because that's the world that we actually live in. And they're probably the scary Cylons that look like us, too. They're probably not the toasters. So, okay, so I think we actually have to like explicitly ask ourselves, what are our ethical lines? What will we work on? What will we not work on? It's probably a good idea to have those conversations before you see your company in the news, just saying. But like, if you can think about where is your line? Like, which people that you serve and the interests that you're serving and the people who are affected by what you're doing and where those interactions are, especially the intended versus unintended effects of any automation that you're creating. And that is, again, the problem with a machine learning system, is we can end up with effects that we didn't intend or expect or predict, but we create a system and we create a clockwork and we set it loose, and a lot of stuff happens that I feel like we need to have those conversations so that even if we don't stop it before it happens, we can get in the way of these things. This, by the way, this is a picture of the Colossus. It was used in code breaking for World War II. And it was pretty unambiguous then for us to be like, tech did great things. Tech saved the world. And it's like, yes, sometimes tech does great things and saves the world. And sometimes, maybe less so. I think we need to think about that. We can't just say, hey, Bletchley Park has museums and tech was great, the end. Like, that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story, and we want to live up to that. So I think it's also interesting that I'm giving this talk in Europe, where arguably there's been a lot more work on and thought about these questions of privacy and security and consent and that sort of thing, because I don't work for a Bay Area company and I don't live in the Bay Area, but I do think that the conversations around tech in the US can often feel very localized to that area. And I'm going to tell you, if you've ever flown to San Francisco and you've looked out your airplane window, you'll see this stuff, this colorful stuff in the water, and you're not even really sure what it is. Maybe you care enough to Google it and find out. It's actually the salt flats. And it's because of not really caring about the environment for quite a while, a major corporation was basically just, mining a lot of salt out of the bay there. But because they're now trying to renew the ecosystem there, these salt flats are going to be gone in probably 30 years. It will be not anywhere near as colorful when we're flying into the Bay Area. But I bring that up because it's very easy for us to look at a context in a specific moment and say, this is good or this is not good, but everything is a continuum. Everything is going to change over time. Even if we look at something one way, it's going to look very different in just a few years. And if you don't believe me, just think about all of the stuff that you're doing with your laptops and your phones, and think about what you were doing a decade ago. And yeah, you were doing a bunch of this stuff, but it wasn't the same. And a decade from now, it's probably not going to be the same, and I hope it's not a much, much worse, more oppressive surveillance society, but I'm a little concerned that we're going that way. And if we talk about ethics of our community at large versus localized to specific areas, if you're going to be in the UK in a few weeks, take a look at coedethics.org. There's going to be a very good conference curated by Gareth Rushgrove and Ann Curry about this topic in London. And if you're in the US, the Bay Area YIMBY community, they're like, yes, in my backyard. We're going to there's a lot of people from tech who are working on making sure that we're turning whatever powers we have towards good things, towards social justice. Because I think that it's important to realize, even those of us who may have been like, I work at a giant corporation, and there's probably parts of it that I'm not going to like, but the parts I'm in are good. And then we realize there's parts that I don't like that I need to have a conversation with, that I need to have a conversation with several layers above my management chain because I'm not happy with specific things. This was my week last week. You can imagine this talk is a little bit different this week than it would have been, a couple weeks ago. But I feel like I'm not the only person, you're not the only person who's thinking to yourself, what is my organization doing? What do we stand for? What do we care about? And what are we going to do? And if you're not asking yourself those questions right now, you probably should be. And hey, if you work at an organization that is just you, then probably it's 100% aligned with everything you want to do, probably. And I have bad news for you if you're at a company of 2 or more people, that not everything will be exactly what you want. Sorry, not sorry. That is reality. But that does mean that these are conversations to have inside your organization of whatever size. Because it is important to realize that we have superpowers and we can use them. And this is a question of how you're going to use them. If you can't read it, by the way, this is a picture from Bletchley Park. And for whatever reason, it seems like they felt the need to have directions on the telephone. So it says, to call, lift telephone and listen. Replace telephone only when finished. And if that seems obvious to you, just think everything, once you've done it, seems easy. We saw lots of great talks today, and some of them had really elegant technical solutions, and you're like, yeah. But you know what? You know as well as I do that when we're starting to create these solutions, it's not like, yeah, this is perfect and obvious and easy. It's never perfect and obvious and easy. It's something that we figure out, usually by doing a bunch of things wrong. And so that gives me hope that, yeah, I think that in the US right now and in Australia and a bunch of places, we're doing some things wrong in terms of watching out for the most vulnerable users in our populations of users of our tech. But I think that we can do better by having these conversations, by taking, whether it's direct action, and think about it this way, there's a lot of places where no one is going to argue with you if you make a coding choice that preserves people's privacy better. No one's going to say to you, why did you do that? That's a terrible idea. If you can defend it technically, hey, look, it's way easier to maintain, and it's way less complicated. That's great. And in terms of indirect action, too, having those conversations inside your organization, inside your communities of practice. There's not like a Boolean between don't care and riot in the streets. Like, there's a lot of things that we can do that I would encourage us to. So very specifically, tactically, though, as I was mentioning, like, just ask yourself every time you're going to log or collect a report on something, do we need to? Can we do this in aggregate? Can we do this in a way that anonymizes it, that de-identifies it, that doesn't open people up later to being targeted for it? Like, this is something that a lot of us in this room are writing the code that figures out how to log something. So I challenge you to all think about that. Can you log it in a way that will do less harm and less complex and less to maintain? So the TLDR on this basically is, I think that we have the technical ability and the human responsibility to focus on this, in terms of making sure people are consenting. People talk about consent in a lot of contexts, but I'm talking specifically about, think about everything you click OK, agree on, that you don't actually read, and you're a professional, and you know that you probably should read it, and there's probably something in term 42A that you're not going to like, and you don't read it. Come on, don't tell me you read it, because I know you don't, because I don't either. But think about what's in there and what people are agreeing to. Make sure that they know about anything that you think could harm them. And for privacy, like, worry about leaking details between abstraction layers. Worry about like having the principle of least privilege to make sure that you're not putting data out there that doesn't need to be out there. And then for safety, just remember, like, there are humans in the mix. They're being affected by everything that you write, by everything that you commit, everything you push to production. There's probably a person who's going to interact with it. And I think it's important for us to remember that. Because I got to tell you, like, I got a computer science degree because I didn't want to talk to people. Turns out, spoiler alert, Soylent Green and tech are made of humans. And you are going to talk to people. And even if you're not talking to them directly, you are shaping the world that they live in. So that's basically it. It's that tech is made of people and adorable cats. You got to have the adorable attack kitten in there. But tech is made of people. And I think we focus a lot. We do. I mean, in this conference, and tomorrow I'm giving a 3-hour workshop on a container orchestrator. And so, like, at DevOps Day. So, like, of course we focus on the tech. That's interesting, and it's something that we like. And I think it's really important for us to also focus on the people, because the tech is not much without the people. I can assure you that while my cat very much enjoys sitting on that laptop because warm, he's not actually going to produce any, production code whatsoever. I've A/B tested this. This is not happening. So yeah, that's pretty much that. Like, I think that we do probably live in the darkest timeline. I'm pretty sure we live in the darkest timeline. But like, until that glorious day when the walls of the multiverse collapse and we can choose to live in the reality where the US president is a woman and she's super progressive and she and Angela Merkel are meeting about politics. Like, yes, I'm imagining that future. That's a pretty exciting future. We don't live in that future right now. Like, right now, the reality that we live in is one that we're stuck in. And I want us to use our tech superpowers to take care of each other in this world. So that's it. Thanks.